Every song is based essentially on a chord progression. The chord progression is the foundation of the piece of music, but there's one particular chord progression that gets used in loads and loads of popular songs, particularly more recent popular songs. That's what we call the 1-5-6-4. So loads of songs are based on this chord progression. But the thing is, we don't have to play these chords just in this very standard format where it's the essential chord, nothing fancy going on. Just because a song is based on a particular chord progression doesn't mean you have to play it a particular way. You can vary and change up how you're playing those chords to add extra levels of depth to that chord progression. And that's what we're going to do today. We're going to start from the most essential, basic way that you could play this chord progression and then build up over 5 levels, introducing different elements, different little touches into the chord progression. So let's start on level 1, which is going to be as basic as we possibly can do it. So we've got C, G, A minor F, 1-5-6-4, and we're literally playing them in what's called root position. The left hand is going to keep it simple as well. We're just going to underpin the chords by playing that root note, but in the left hand. So when we play a C chord in the right hand, we're going to play the note C in our left hand, and they'll always match. So when we play the G chord, we have the note G, A minor, we have the note A, F, F, always matching. Just keeping it simple, but effective. So that is our level 1 of the 1-5-6-4. So let's take it up just a little bit, add a little bit more complexity. We're going to think about different inversions so the chords can sort of blend and move together a bit more naturally and musically. So an inversion is when we take a chord, but we don't necessarily play it in this sort of standard order where we've got the root note at the bottom. It's the same notes, but we might move the bottom one, for example, C here, to the top. That is an inversion of a C major chord. It's actually first inversion. We've inverted it once from root position. One inversion, that's first inversion. Or we can invert it again. So taking that new shape we've got, we could take, once again, the bottom note, move it to the top. And now it's second inversion. It's still a C major chord, but they're different inversions of that chord. So the sort of process you want to go through when choosing inversions to choose how to voice lead a chord progression is simply thinking, I want to move as little as possible. I want to minimize the movement, because not only will that make it easier to play, but that will make it sound nicer, it will make it sound smoother. So we need to think about the notes that are in those two chords. The chord of C has C, E, and G. The chord of G has G, B, and D. So what notes are in common between those two chords? Well, it's just the G, right? There's a G in a G chord, and there's also a G in a C chord. So we can keep that G stationary as we move between the two chords, C and G. It's the same notes as our normal G chord, G, B, and D, but we kept the G where it was in the previous chord. Makes it easier to play, makes it easier on the ears as well. Now you might be thinking, well, what if there isn't a consistent note? Well, that's the case with the next chord in the progression. We're on G, we need to go to A minor. A minor has the notes A, C, and E. G has the notes G, B, and D. There's nothing in common there. So all we can do here is just move to a local A minor chord. So we could go to this one, or we could still use an inversion. We could go to this one. Still an A minor chord, A, C, and E, just not in the normal root position. And finally, going from A minor to F, well, this is a good one because A minor, A, C, and E, and F, F, A, C, have two notes in common. The only difference between an A minor chord and an F chord is that top note, E or F. If it's got E, it's A minor. If it's got F, it's an F chord. So when we're on our A minor chord, all we have to do is change one note and we get the F chord, the last chord in our progression. Final step we need to think about is how we get back to the start. F chord going to C major, we have one note in common, the C. So we keep the C where it is, and we can bring these two down to go back to C where we started. And when we put that all together, we get this. So C in root position, G in our first inversion, A minor in our first inversion, and remember we just have to move one note to get to the F, which is in our second inversion. So now we're going to move on to level 3 of our 1-5-6-4 chord progression. And we're going to carry over some of the stuff we did in the previous level. We're going to add a consistent note, what you could call an inverted pedal tone if you want to sound fancy, but really it's just a consistent note that we're going to shove into all 4 chords to sort of glue them together, to marry them together. In fact, the first 2 chords in this chord progression already have a consistent note. We were sort of talking about it a minute ago. The chord C and the chord G, which are our 1 and 5 in the key of C, they both have a note in common. G, here at the top. Part of the reason why they sound so good together, because they don't require too much change from one to the other. This G acts as a sort of anchor to keep everything together. Now, of course, the A minor, like we were saying before, doesn't have a G in it, but we can change that. We can add a G in, we can just shove it in here. On top of the notes we need for the A minor, which are A, C, and E, we can add in an additional G here as well. It's technically changed what we would call the chord. It's now an A minor 7. The G is the 7. But once again, we don't necessarily have to worry about that. We can just imagine it as an A minor, but with an extra little flavor thrown in, an extra sort of color note. So we've got the A minor with the G thrown in. We're going to do the same thing with the F. So we go to our F as usual, but also jam the G in there as well. And I love this one in particular because you get this nice kind of cluster of these notes together where it has a rub to it, but it actually sounds quite satisfying. And that creates this sense of cohesion between all of the different chords. It's keeping it consistent. So that is our 3rd level, adding in that consistent note, that G, into all of the chords. And level 4 is all about adding what you could call passing chords, chords in between the chords, which act almost as steps. The first passing chord we're going to do is between C and G. So did you see there? I played a different chord before I got to G. We had C, and then something else, and then G. What we played in that gap, that passing chord, is what we can call G sus4. Sus is short for suspended, and you can sort of hear that. It's suspended in the air, waiting to resolve onto that other note, onto the proper note that we expect in G, the B. So G sus4, that chord contains the notes G, C, and D, instead of what you'd usually expect in the G chord, which is G, B, and D. Start from the top, C major, and then rather than going straight to G, we're going to go to G sus4 to start with, and after a couple beats, let it go to where it would normally be on the G chord. Now we're going to move to A minor, so no passing chord here, just going straight to A minor as usual. And then we're going to move to F. Once again, no passing chord, but what we're going to do is add a passing chord in here to take us back round to the beginning, easing in to the next chord. So that takes us to level 5, our sort of most complex level that we're going to do today. So for the first chord in our sequence, C, we're going to keep it as it is. C in the left hand, the chord of C in the right hand. But for the next chord, we're not going to play G, we're actually going to play B instead, which you'll notice is a note in our chord. So it still works, but it creates a different sort of context in which to hear the chord. So that's going to be like this: C, G with the B down below it. And then we're going to go to A A minor, and for the A minor, we'll have A, as usual. So you hear there, we got this sort of stepping down motion. The next part is on the F chord. We're actually going to put it under a note that's not in the chord. We're going to put the note G under the chord F. And you can hear that suddenly adds like an extra dimension to the chord. Rather than just normal F, it's like another layer has been added to the harmony. So it's going to sound like this. We go to F initially, but then to G. So that's the main part of level 5, but I wanted to add in one extra detail here, just to really finish off here, and that's to add in, once again, a passing chord, but not a suspended chord. What I'm going to add in now is a diminished chord. We've got regular C, and then we've got G over B, and I'm going to do this. That's my diminished chord. That's A minor, and we're back onto familiar ground. So that chord, even though in isolation sounded kind of pretty stark, pretty in your face, here it comes again. G sharp, diminished. Diminished are one of those chords where, on their own, in isolation, they sound very dissonant, almost kind of scary or something, but it's the tension created in these chords which is what makes them so useful, because once we get this tension, we then get such a sense of relief when we then moves to the next chord. So the notes of the G sharp diminished chord are G sharp, B, and D. Now, because of where our previous chord was, the G chord, I didn't play it G sharp, B, D, and put the G sharp at the top. So it was near where the G was. So our G chord was B, D, G, then we have B, D, G sharp. And you'll notice that the only difference between a G major chord and a G sharp diminished chord is whether it has a G or a G sharp. So that's all we have to think about. In that moment when we're going from G to G sharp diminished, we don't have to think, okay, what are the notes of a G sharp diminished chord? We just have to think, okay, I'm currently on this chord, and let's just change the G to G sharp. And so this is what it could sound like if I mixed and matched all of these different levels together. So there are 5 levels of the same chord progression. And of course, don't feel like you have to master all 5 levels. The point of this exercise is adding different skills, different approaches to your arsenal as a player. So you can apply this not just to this chord progression, but to any chord progression you play. I've been David Bennett on piano, and I'll see you next time.